Welcome to everyone who is watching on YouTube through the MSM website. My name is Justin Bischof, and this is the MSM Conversations Over 80, where I interview and get to know and we talk with incredibly distinguished members of the music community who have been involved with the Manhattan School of Music. And this is a chance for us to really get to know them and their history and their ideas and just what they want to share with us about their journey in the music world. It is an incredible honor today to have Ron Carter with us. He doesn't need much of an introduction, but I'm going to give a big one for all of you out there. The jazz world, but especially the classical world, so that we all get to know who this great man is. So I'm going to do some reading to begin before we do our questions. All right, so before I start, I want to congratulate you on your 85th and your celebration at Carnegie Hall, which was, I'm told, a blowout. You said it was an amazing experience.
Yeah, had a great time. I had a great time.
Which is what counts, right? So Ron Carter is among the most original, prolific, and influential bassists in jazz history, with more than 2,200 albums to his credit, an accomplishment honored in the 2015 Guinness World Book of Records. From '63 to '68, Ron was a member of the classic and acclaimed Miles Davis Quintet. He's recorded with everybody, including Tommy Flanagan, Gil Evans, Lena Horne, Bill Evans, B.B. King, the Kronos Quartet, Bobby Timmons, Eric Dolphy, etc. He's won 3 Grammys, including one just this year. Yeah. Far more than a major influencer in jazz, Carter has appeared on seminal recordings in spoken word with A Tribe Called Quest, rock, Aretha Franklin, Roberta Flack, Billy Joel, Paul Simon, and classical music with arrangements and recordings. At 85, he continues to record, tour the world with his trio, quartet, nonet, and big band. He's written a series of books teaching his signature bass method, and recently he reinvented music transcription with his chartography method. And then here is a clip from his biographer, Dan Ouellette, from his book 2014. At 6 feet 4 inches, the bassist towers over the bandstand, no longer relegated to the back in the shadows behind the frontline players. And in historical shift of jazz bass playing, he's no longer just a timekeeper, a rhythm man, a sidekick to the spotlight artist, but an architect of the highest order, an impromptu composer even when he's not taking solos. Pliable yet powerful, the instigator, the catalyst, the shepherd, the finest walker in the history of jazz, the risk-taker with an elegant streak, refined, the anchor of Miles Davis's classic 60s quintet, the most recorded jazz bassist of all time, National Endowment for the Arts jazz master. If he were a character in a novel, he would be the protagonist. How's that for an introduction?
So far, so good.
So far, so good. To begin with, we can just chat quickly about your connection to MSM. So you received a master's in bass in 1961.
Yes.
And then you got an honorary doctorate in 1998.
Yes.
And you joined the faculty in, I believe, 2011?
Yes.
And you just retired this year?
Yes.
After all those years. So I wanted to start with the sort of the obvious questions. When you're growing up as a child, why music and why the bass? How did that start?
Well, I'm 12 years old at that time, and the teacher, a person walks into our small room in Ferndale, Michigan, and says to the children, I'm going to start an orchestra here, and on this table, there are some instruments. Once you walk up, pick out one that you think that you want to spend some time with, and we'll form an orchestra. That's how I got started.
Wow, and I believe it was the cello?
That was the cello, yes.
So they didn't put the double bass on the table. And then, so how did you make the shift to the double bass?
Well, I was getting better and better, and as I got better as the 12 and 13 and 14 and 15-year-old, the teachers I had were equally interested in helping me go to the next level, whatever they deemed that to be. I am now in high school at Cass Tech High, and I'm noticing that the PTA groups, the educational societies, would have meetings in Detroit, and they would call certain schools to provide some wallpaper music for the conferences and background. And I noticed that for my perceived talent, I wasn't getting the calls that I thought that I should have been getting. And I look around and noticed that the bass player is graduating in January of 1955. And by subtracting, if you subtract him, there's no one there, there's a big zero. Yep. I decided that if I'm the only guy playing bass, then don't have to call me. So I traded in my bit cello for a bass and took some lessons, and Ended up playing bass in the Cass-Tech Orchestra, which I was graduated in 1955. I took an audition for George McKell, who at the time was playing with the Detroit Symphony as well as on the Eastman School faculty. And so I showed enough promise to give me a full scholarship as a bass player for to the Eastman School of Music, so which I graduated from June of 1959.
Right, so I was wondering when I was reading all about your information how you ended up or chose Eastman, because there were several schools. So it's because he was in the Detroit, which was the local orchestra. You know, you've had such an exceptionally busy and just driven career. It's just hearing that story, it makes a lot of sense that you saw an opening, you enjoyed cello, but you were pragmatic and had a plan to go to the bass.
I thought I had something to do. I thought I had the chance to make some music.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed orchestral playing. I liked listening to the themes develop. I liked playing with 6 or 7 other players in the section. I enjoyed watching orchestra members become acquainted with not just the library, but with each other. First trumpet, second trumpet, what do they do? You got six cello players or 5 bass players. Who determines the fingering? Who determines the bowing? These things interested me, and I thought that I could figure that out. Let's do this.
And so how many bass students were there at Eastman at that time?
Oh, 8 or 9.
So it was substantial.
Oh, number. Yeah, full body, student body, yeah.
It's interesting. I'm an orchestral conductor in addition to being a concert organist, and improv is a huge part of what I do in concerts classically. But I'm not a jazz guy. I love jazz, but I have some questions I wanted to ask you, and we're sort of addressing this to all the people watching who are classical musicians.
Okay.
As someone who just I'm obsessed with improv, and I do full concerts of them. And so some of these questions are basic, but as a bass player, I'm obsessed with the bass line as a conductor and also as an organist. So when I'm conducting the orchestra, I'm always focusing on the bass equally to the melody. But in jazz, you're doing the bass line, you're listening to you know the melody, and you're focused with the harmony. Is that constant all the time? Is there times when your focus shifts? Like what is the approach when you're a jazz basser?
I don't know about those other guys and gals, but I think the bass player is the guy who determines the music. I don't care who the band leader is, the bass player is leading the band. Every note I play, each note I play is the pitch of the band, the general tone. Each note I play, each note determines where I think the form is. This is the bridge, this is the first 8, this is a turnaround going back. Each note I play determines the rhythm of the band. Where is this beat? That's 3 jobs with the same note. Each note I play, it determines the presence of the bass sound in the organization. It's a person whose voice must be accounted for. Each note I play, it determines the groove. We're playing the 8/8 beat, there's a 6/8/4. What kind of beat are we playing? That's 5 choices that each note I play covers. So there's no time to take off a chorus. There's no time to just focus on the bills for tomorrow. There's no time to take off for missing the plane ride tomorrow. My job is to be responsible for all those items all the time. And the moment I stop responding to any of those responsibilities, I have to go home. I can't play the band.
That all makes a lot of sense. You mentioned the groove, and I've been speaking to some of my I have a few jazz friends who are very accomplished, and I was asking them some input on some questions, and they said, when it comes to a jazz trio, the role of the drummer and who you've worked with as a drummer is in many ways more important than the pianist. And I don't like making a hierarchy, but it was an interesting concept for me.
I don't agree with that at all. I think in the trio, there are equal parts of responsibility. And since I'm determined to be the guy who each note does these 5 options, I can't sit around and wait for someone else to make those choices for me. Of course, we're listening in stereo. At the piano, you got the drums, and you have your concept. And during the course of a song, during the course of a chorus, these ideas of the possibilities were all like a Where's Waldo?
Right.
And I think my job is to help them determine, at least let them know that I think the zone for this piece is right there. To make that work, I have to understand the song, song form, I have to know the changes, I have to have a pretty decent bass to make the bass do what it's supposed to do. You know, and to say that in a trio, the drummer has the, because he's in theory the loudest one, the hierarchy starts with him or her. I'm not a subscriber to that idea at all.
And so when you work in a jazz trio, it's like any, I guess, chamber music, it's collaborative.
Absolutely.
And it's not that one person is leading or deciding.
Well, that's almost correct. I like to think that I'm still doing that, but I've learned to step back and see who's going to take the fish, who's going to take the bait. I'm going like this,
right.
You know, or who's going to allow me to assist them in developing an idea, or who is going to allow me to be the beginner, the starter of a dynamic piano, fortissimo. Or who's going to allow me to go from a Brazilian bossa nova beat to a swing four? Who's going to allow me to trust my sense of judgment to try to impose, literally, my will on this next chorus?
That's leadership too, isn't it? It's not always being out in front. It's like letting people fill the space. And
I think good leaders understand when to step back and when to step forward.
Right. But you certainly have had, I'm sure, favorite drummers and pianists you've worked with. I'm not always a big fan of like the list of everyone's favorite, but because I know that every experience has its merit. But are there some that stand out for you that?
I'm sure there are, and of all the questions I'm asked to respond to, one of them is always, who's the best piano player you played with? Or who's the most interesting drummer you played with? Or what band showed you the most music? And to answer that question means that all those other experiences were less valuable to me. And since that's not how I feel, I just explained to the questionnaire that my response to that specific question is that they were all my teachers. And I appreciated going to class with these people, whether they played drums, horn, piano, arrangers. I enjoyed being in their classroom, which is called the bandstand, and taking a lesson on how this person evolves his harmonic values, how he or she delineates responsibility, how he or she treats us as the band around him or her, as equals despite not being the band leader. They all offer these free lessons in leadership, in musicianship, composition, the general demeanor, the general representative view that this band. For example, when my groups play, we go out to the front of the station, take a bow before we play one note. I'm letting the band announce that we are here on a serious event playing a concert. And now that you've seen us looking really nicely, sit back and enjoy some music, I'm trying to set the table for them. That's part of my job. And I learned things like that during the course of my 62-and-a-half-year career, you know?
Yeah, I didn't ask for the favorite though. I never do that. I always like to at least say some, but I completely understand. Every experience is a learning and a growth.
Absolutely.
For sure. Something I learned about that I didn't know about as much at all, and I was reading about this, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on third stream. It's new to Mr. Classical Guy here, and I know that term was coined by Gunther Schuller. Do you agree with that term? Is it an accurate description? And I know you were really involved with the CTI, and you were recording in the 70s and all of that. Just your thoughts on third stream.
No one ever told me what that really meant. It was a nice pigeonhole for the critics to define the modern jazz quartet with the Oscar Peterson trio or the Ornette Coleman quartet. It was a nice way for them to not worry about what the audience would think the title of this music was. It was to give them a pigeonhole to put this music in. Okay, that's good PR and advertising guys, you know. But I never understood what the definition of that term was. So it didn't allow me to get wasting my time figuring out, well, what do I mean by third stream? I always thought of a guy fishing, and he changes his fishing pole to a bigger rod, and he changes his style and yeah, third stream. I mean, I didn't quite get the connection between a third stream and, as I told you before, each of my notes do these 5 things. What stream do my choices fit in? Yeah.
It's interesting because I looked up what Schuller said, and to your point, he has a list of points of what it's not,
Yeah.
which is which really kind of proves what you're saying. It's
cheating.
not jazz with strings. It's not jazz played on classical instruments. It's not classical music played by jazz players. It's not inserting Ravel and Schoenberg between bebop changes. It's not jazz in fugue form. It's not a fugue played by jazz. And finally, it's not designed to do away with jazz or classical music. It is just another option amongst many for today's musicians. It's interesting to define my negative, what it's not.
Interesting that he's kind of backed out of that.
Right.
But he got tagged with being the guy responsible for it, and good or bad, he's still connected with that pigeonholing of this, at the time, pretty different music that was not new, it was very new to the scene. It was getting some interest, getting some ink, getting some new patrons, getting some new players. It did all those things.
And how would you define the newness of it at the time?
Well, guys were now thinking about maybe ignoring the form of songs. Jazz was really strictly a song form that didn't go between 32 bars, A, B, A. There was not much variety in that. And it wasn't critical because there were so many guys playing so much stuff on this theoretically limited envelope of a 32-bar song form. I think what this third stream brought to the jazz community was a different segment of instruments, for example. You heard bad jazz bassoonists. You heard jazz harpsichordists. You know, you heard jazz harpists. You know, instruments that were not normally a part of you walking into a club and seeing these instruments on the stage. That's more kind of stuff you see when you go to a concert or a music shop.
Right.
You know, they brought to the jazz scene, in general and in theory, another way to play the changes that jazz players had not discovered, they thought, at that time.
Does that continue today in terms of third stream existing, or is it just so much more diversified now that the term doesn't apply anymore?
It's just music right now. It's always been just music for me, you know.
Right.
And there are groups who thrive on being designated as the third stream group of the week. You know, the new third stream record of the year, based on someone's view of what third stream music really is. And again, until one of those people really tell me what they think music of the third stream designation happens to be, then I can continue that kind of discussion. Right now, it's just another form of a way to play changes that I would not stumble across playing the normal jazz standard.
For some reason, when you mentioned jazz harpsichord, it brought this up. The originally, bass wasn't amplified, right? And then as the century came along, it became amplified. And this was something that I was not aware of in my sort of world view of music. How big a deal was that, the amplification?
Oh, man, it was tremendous. There's still a group of people with a concept that the bass need not be amplified.
Really?
And to those people, as many or as few as they are, I explain to them, well, when I play a concert, I want to invite anyone's grandmother and give them a seat in row 37F, way up there, and have them hear every note I play, because it's important for them to understand my trying to develop a line, my helping the band go another direction. Have them enjoy the options for their listening pleasure, that each note I have for them can help them. And there's not any way in this planet right now that a group can successfully translate that sensitivity to the person sitting way up there. I insist, Justin, that they be part of my concept. I want them to feel the wave of the notes. I want them to feel the delay. I want them to feel a note that's just a little bit sharp or flat so I can get their attention. I want them to sense that here comes a new rhythm, or here comes this idea developed way over here. And there's no way that's going to happen without some bass being amplified. What that has also done, however, is put bass players on the mark. Now that they can hear every note you play, you can't be comfortable behind the palm tree anymore.
Right, right. You can't hide behind the fig leaf.
Yeah.
You mentioned sensitivity, so obviously it seems to me that there would have to be sensitive amplification. Yeah.
You know, one of the things that I think that the jazz fusion group brought to the jazz community playing was that they wanted that their live performances have the same presence and the same quality of sound as their recordings.
Right.
Their recordings were pristine, and they were incredible. You hear all the percussion, you hear the guitar pick and stuff, just really wonderfully individual sounds that made this great jazz rock band sound even better because you heard all the elements. They brought that concept to the bandstand. And to that extent, they would bring their own sound guys to the big theaters. They would bring their own equipment to the theaters. They would bring their own specific things
to have control over
yes.
the blend and the
Absolutely.
sound, so it's not just at the whim of some tech guy who has it up too high.
Or none at all.
Or none, and it's not enough, and you're like doing your thing,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
And of course, in a recording, it's all being mastered in the studio, so it sounds...
It's controlled by somebody
right,
who knows
so there
what
was
to do.
that. So what is the mindset of the people who don't think it? They think it's not authentic? They think it's...
I haven't talked to anyone who was able to sit down and explain to me in terms that my age group understands why the bass player being unamplified is the thing. It's the thing to do. And I've kind of stepped away from that discussion anymore, because until someone sits down and says, look, this is a good example of these examples of why the bass player's sound is not critical to the development of this groove sound, I'm not really interested in kind of much conversation with them.
Mm-hmm. And I guess from a technique point of view, if you're trying to overplay to make sound, if you're not being amplified, it can't be good.
It isn't just that, it's just that the presence
right, you're just not
in the groove of the sound. You know, I hear them say that this room is a perfect room. Well, I've been playing it a long time, man. And I haven't seen a perfect room that had the same presence of the bass player, given the ensembles that are there, worthy of a, boy, what a great sound he had, but I just couldn't hear him, kind of commentary.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
No, I'm not there yet.
Well, I'm glad to hear that answer. Shifting a little bit, you have stayed so busy all the time, and when we do mentoring to musicians and to students, they're always asking, how do you build a career? How do you do it? And the standard answer is, know your craft, be really good, and connect with people. But some people are just better at it than others, and you are obviously exceptional at it. For the young players who are watching this, do you have any sort of thoughts on how you've been able to do that so successfully, apart from being brilliant at what you do?
You have to ask those people who call me. I've always been fascinated, Justin, by the number of calls I get from a part of the big M music community who know of my playing, and that's not their normal, as I understand what normal is, path of hearing music. And evidently these people who do these non-jazz projects have enough connection with their connections in their music world to say, well, maybe this guy who played on this jazz record, maybe he would kind of join us on this, I need that flavor for this particular ballad I'm working on, or what a sound he had on this real fast tune. I wonder if he could do that same kind of sound on my song, whether it's a body blues record or a blues track. And I commend these people, of course, because they give me work, and they help my name get out there in environments that are not normally my environment. But the fact is that I'm able to find out what this person needs me to do, and can I deliver on why they hired me. So I tell my students, when you get these calls from people who have you in mind to help their project, I say, leave your ego at home and bring both ears. Because I will tell you, as I've been able to figure out, what do they need that makes my presence mandatory for this particular track or for this record.
Keep your ego at home and bring your ears. That first part, I mean, we're supposed to bring our ears always, but the ego part seems to be more and more of a challenge these days, at least in my experience. That brings us to teaching and your time at MSM. I would love to hear, I'd love to know how for your experience, how the school has changed from 1961 to now? I mean, it was in the old building, right?
Third Avenue.
Right.
Yeah, it was a task getting from my home uptown Harlem, the subways and the base in 1960 in the dark of the night at 2 o'clock in the morning from a gig downtown to home to the private lesson with Barbara Bernand out in Queens.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a task, but I found that this kind of challenge to go from playing the nightclub at 2 o'clock in the morning, getting home at 3:30 in the morning, with an 8 a.m. theory class. If I could do that, that would convince me that I belong in this music. If I can follow my path, given how difficult it is right now, I'd have a car. If I can allow me the grace to step back and say, I'm doing all this work, that means I must really love this music.
Well, you're
if I love it, I got to get better at it.
Yeah,
I get better at it. And here's a chance for me to get better at this music that I would not normally have if I didn't take this opportunity. Interesting enough, back in the day, I was just starting to travel. And as a student, you get classes and stuff like that, And Sidney Bednar, who goes way back, 1962, 63 with me, 60. I had a chance to go to Europe my first time with Cannonball Adderley in the spring of 1960.
So you're in the middle of your master's.
Yes, I am. And I'm going to the library and washing dishes, all that stuff, man. And I explained to them I had a chance to go to Europe. There's a really good, famous band. There's a chance for me to get better. I said, okay, but you have to play your audition when you get back. I said, oh, man. I'm walking like this. Okay. So I get back finally, and the audition is a week after I get back, because I had no time I wasn't scheduled because I was left town.
Was this your first jet lag experience?
Yes.
Right.
And I said, well, I have no piano player, I have no song picked out. I said, who's going to come to me, So Mr. Bednar said, find the music and I'll play it. Ultimately, I found the bassoon concerto transcribed from maybe a Handel of the bassoon solo, da 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 da. And he got to the piece, got to the small room in 103rd Street and 3rd Avenue or somewhere, wherever it was. And I practiced the piece on the road because I knew it was coming up. I just didn't know the details of the music. And of course, he was an experienced accompanist. He kind of led me along the path. He thought that was what the music was demanding. And ultimately played the little recital for about 35 minutes of what I could play. And I got my degree as I was supposed to get it, But I think it was this challenged path that seemed to be my sign. That if you want to get this music into your system and really get good, this process to develop your patience, to develop how far ahead you can see past the first 2/5 chord.
Right.
I belong here.
So there you are, and you're going to a bass classical degree, but you're gigging and you're doing jazz.
Yes.
So can you just, for someone who's 18 now and just doesn't, and has always known that those all exist, back then, I mean, there weren't jazz schools, and we're going to get to that. How did you have that dual life, even though it seems normal and natural, that you're doing theory and you're learning maybe Botticini and other bass stuff, but you're off doing these gigs and in a different style?
I was trying to get my name around town, and Bill Lee, who's the father of Spike Lee, was a wonderful bass player and a really great arranger. He was the folk singer's go-to bass player when they came to New York. They had to have this person playing bass with them. And of course, the more people came to New York, to the coffee houses in the early 60s, to Jack Kerouac, kind of the Allen Ginsberg group of people, the more people came who needed a bass player. So Bill Lee, having met me with the bass violin choir he was leading, I was his go-to sub when they came in and he was too busy. It was that seeing that I could contribute to an environment that was not mine in terms of a classical, the Schubert Quintet. you know, or the bass solo in the Othello. What I was learning at school, it in of itself didn't make me easier to get into the folk singing thing. But they had the same notes, man. They had the same intensity, and they had the same intention. And so I'm having a chance to practice the Marriage of Figaro only as a ballad, playing with this folk singer who's talking over my bass lines. I said, wow, man, I'm not sure that's okay, but let's try to make it work tomorrow night.
That's opera.
That kind of stuff, yes.
Right, right. But, and again, so when you're 16, you didn't have jazz teachers?
Not at all.
You were doing it, playing with people and learning?
Yes.
That's exceptional. So that, to me, leads to not a controversial question, but an important question. Jazz schools, developed later, Manhattan School.
Sure.
Do you think, I think of jazz as being incredibly original, the idea of individualism and being in a group, but the art of improv. Do you think there's any detriment, and I say this as a proud MSMer, to systematize jazz instruction versus how you learned? Not
at all. I think at some point, Justin, there was a concept that the more you play, the jazz player hurt your chops. If you took lessons, it took away that innate ability to play the instrument good. And, if you read music, it stunted your creativity to compose a song. All these myths start taking root all over the place, man. And I would say, wait a minute, that's not true, man. If you have no language skills, how can you tell me what you want me to play? How can we talk about keys and what's the right? Is this song a nice song, but it's in the wrong key? How can we discuss that if you don't have the language skills? Since jazz doesn't have itself any specific language skills, how can I help you make your decision to hire me? Okay, if we can't talk about what the issues are with this particular track or this date. So I said, wait, no, let's just stop. And I can help you. If you don't keep telling me, can you play a little more orange here or a little more, no, I don't know that. That's not what I do. I can help you, but I need something more specific. And I think along the way, we developed a common vocabulary that allows me to explain to them why this chord didn't quite fit, but you trust my note, I'll help it work. And they can tell me, I like this melody, but your note is in the wrong way. Can you fix that for me? That kind of verbal detail. And the more you understand the verbal detail, the more calls you get, because people see that for as specific as your occupation is called jazz bass player. There's so many other areas of music that you can fit comfortably in. Call them for this job, or call them for that one. Call them for this. You're on the track, just one bass player for track, call this guy. You got a film score, call this guy. That kind of connection seems much easier to happen once they understand that there's a language skill, language meaning technique, the ability to read music, the ability to understand what's behind this chord. Those kind of things make the jobs available to you if you decide to accept them. And I tell my students, there's never a bad gig. You just play terrible. It's just, next.
I recently had a guy come from Nashville who doesn't read music, but was producing sessions, and he was just almost in tears. He said, I tell them I want it more, not orange, but something like that, and then they say, hang on, and then they take 10 minutes and figure it out. He says, I need to learn how to read music. I'm like, yeah, it's just the language and the technique.
Yeah, that's one reason why it's necessary.
But so let me flip the question around. Would you have preferred when you were doing a master's and an undergraduate that you went to a jazz program like Manhattan School of Music?
It never occurred to me that was available.
Because it wasn't.
That's correct.
Right.
I'm going to the University of Nightclubs.
University of Nightclubs, okay. That makes sense. The bass extension, were you involved with developing that?
Well, an interesting story. I was going, I had run into Dave Horine, bless his soul, who was a bass maker, bass repairman in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I was going on tour, and I didn't want to, I'm always been curious about what basses are available. Is there one that makes my job easier? Is there a better bass now over there that I don't have? What's the market? Can I afford them? Where do you find these places?
Right.
So I was just kind of just strike out on my own, get to town and go and see what this luthier here and that repairman there, and he had stories about this guy's great. Let me go see it, just stuff. And I went to this guy's shop one day, and he would talk about bass and jazz and stuff like that, you know. And he said, well, look, I got an idea about making a bass extension. Well, I knew about them because my teacher, Oscar Zimmerman, used to play one at Eastman. But it added 10 pounds to the bass, and the machines always got out of order and stuff. So I said, well, I know about those things, man, but they had to wait till the bass. I'm walking around with no car, man. I'm on the subway, man, you know.
Right.
He said, well, I got a different kind of idea. I said, well, what's the idea? So he told me that his plan was this. He showed it to me, and he said, if you don't like it, come back and I'll fix it for you. That was in 1968, I think. So the first extension of that type was done by Dave Horine on my bass that I still have, machine and all, that I played last night. 1967, 68 was the first one like that. Finger bass.
So I looked it up and I found someone named Don Robertson, and it was in the 80s, and I thought, well, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I was already 10 years ahead of that time. Yeah.
You know, that brings up something in my mind about the jazz scene, African-American life, and some things being stolen sometimes, and things not being properly accredited. And when I was looking this up, I was worried that this was one of those things. Not to, you know, try to create a sad story, but I mean, at the same time, I wanted to know kind of the history of that and how much of that you might have experienced.
The jazz player goes to a classical concert to hear the orchestra.
Right.
But the orchestral player doesn't come to a jazz club to hear the jazz player. That seems to me to be still the case. And there are jazz societies, you know, the ISB, are a great group of people. They're groups of bass players, jazz and classical, who get together for conventions, that's the right word.
Right.
They exist. But I'm talking about getting down to the guy's environment, coming to a nightclub and see a jazz player. How does he do this all night? He has no dressing room. He walks from the street right to the bandstand. The piano may not be the best piano. His bass may not be the best bass, but he somehow manages to affect the concept and the groove of that band. That's amazing to me. And he's the only bass player in that band. He can't ask anybody for fingering.
Right.
He turns his own pages. You know, and I'm telling you, man, you get these 5-page pieces of score, and you play like this, and you play like this, and you try to, yeah, I mean, so I think they should see this environment. They should be curious as to, how does this person do that, man, with no dressing room? But with no, he's got his coat on the hanger by the door as you walk in. I mean, what's wrong with this picture, you know? And I think the more they see our environment, then they may not appreciate it more, but they would know that there's another way to get this music done. And these people, despite the inconvenience of playing this instrument, are determined to be a force for this music. I think once they understand that, their view will have to change as to what they do. And hopefully they'll be comfortable enough to come to a nightclub and see another jazz player, a bass player play. You know, jazz bass player, they're responsible for a lot of new fingering on the bass. Mm-hmm. They detune the strings all the time to make the stuff. Yeah, you know. And why would the bass player orchestra not want to come down to a jazz club and see this person, you know, do what they do? And given the difficulty of being able to do that, you know, I've walked, and I'm sure you know this feeling of walking 4 or 5 blocks from the parking lot to the club because there's nowhere else to park your car. It's snowing, it's raining, people are already having dinner. You're trying to tune up over a guy having a salad.
I can't, yeah. And you're right, the double bass is the most inconvenient
instrument. To say the least.
It reminds me of a story of Horowitz, you know, the pianist, and I think he went with Levine. They went to hear Art Tatum. They went to Harlem, and I think Horowitz had been working on Tea for Two or something, and they gave it to Tatum. He was like, oh. And so they used to go to the clubs to watch it because he had the most,
amazing.
I mean, to the point that the great classical pianists were like, well, how do you play like that? But it reminds me of the idea of knowing each other's worlds. In terms of the jazz world evolving and you know, racial equality and just how the world is very different than it was in the 60s.
Oh, yeah.
And you have in part of both worlds. How would you want to talk about that in terms of how that has been a part of your life and how it's changed?
Well, before I call it the big intermission, the pandemic took over.
Big intermission.
I'd be able to tell you when the ships from London, from Europe were coming to the States, because they all had bands. And at some point, I would get a ring on my phone, the bass player from the USS Lion or whatever it was. They're in town and then they're in port in New York for 4 or 5 days. And I don't know if I can get a lesson from you. I said, well, I don't know. What do you do, man? He said, well, I'm playing the orchestra and wherever it is, but I'm on this cruise, so I want to get to New York for a couple of weeks. I would tell you when the season for the liners coming to New York was, because those bass players, who were also doubling with the orchestra works, they were coming for a lesson. I missed those opportunities, to have that connection with them, and that those 2 bass players on this cruise ship or coming there next week, that they would know that I live in New York and I'm working somewhere. They would stop their plan to come see me play and talk about the instrument. That always pleased me, because I said, there's a bunch of guys and gals out here who want to know what else goes on with the bass that I don't know about. And when they would come to New York, we would talk about bass, we talk about rosin, talk about bow hair, talk about end pins, stuff that we have to stumble on because we don't have the bass player community doesn't have the group connectivity that lets us know where to get this done, or where to get that done, or who's the best guy for rosin, who's the best guy for woolly hair, who has the best end pin holders, who makes the best bass cases.
Just you argue about French versus Italian?
Yeah, all those details. The Germans, we got all these details. Exactly. They know about that stuff, and I need to find out not just how do you know that, but thank you for sharing it.
And is those kind of connections, is that grown and evolved more over the years?
It's starting to, again, it's starting to get cranked. Now that the world's opening up again, it's starting to become more curious as to what's on the other side of intermission. Not the band's coming back to the bandstand. What happened while I was away? Or while we were away.
Exactly. And so then in terms of the classical, the jazz, and different races, everyone has been coming more together over the years?
Yes, absolutely.
This is one of those silly questions from the other kind of interviews, but if you hadn't taken this path, this musical path, what could you have seen yourself being?
A scientist. I think musicians, by and large, are a very curious breed. And those guys who settle into a specific laboratory, a jazz group, have the chance to use this experimental environment, this jazz group, to try different chemicals. A little faster tonight, a little different key for this night, rearrange my solo order, make a better arrangement, convince this guy he's playing too loud and still keep him in the band. These kind of options are available to any scientist who's curious about how his environment affects the results of his experiment. My response to questions about the Miles Band was that I was happy to be in this laboratory. That every night Miles would bring in these chemicals. We call them tunes. And our job was to mix and match these chemicals to see what happened when we put a little more tonight or a little less tonight, and what happened to the result of this, and could the members of the experimental group, the remaining members of the band, agree on some of these results to develop these results the next night. And since we're in the same band, playing the same library, with the same chemicals, it was easy to develop a memory and a mindset that, okay, well, we experimented on this last night. Maybe we won't do that tonight. Maybe we'll just play. No, that didn't work. No, not again, please. We'll do this. That kind of open-minded scientific curiosity, that the band was the same band for 5.5 years or whatever it was. And the library was small, and they got developed a library. I think that allowed us to be really a good scientist. And so if I wasn't playing the bass player, I'll be trying to play the scientist.
That's a fantastic answer. Thank you. Maestro, thank you so much
Hey,
for this
man.
interview. It was a real pleasure.
You're welcome.
We're really thrilled.
Thank you.
Hope you all enjoyed. Thanks so much.